Good day. In the midst of all the debate and discussion about a possible Ukrainian offensive in the Donbass, another new, very powerful player has appeared and has given a rather strong warning, though a rather discreet warning, to Ukraine that it might want to consider carefully some of the steps it is taking. The player in question is China, and the context in which this has happened is actually extremely interesting. Now, before proceeding to discuss the warning itself, some history is needed. China has become a major investor in Ukraine, a fact which is not widely known, but which has in fact been an increasingly important factor in sustaining the Ukrainian economy, despite the repeated crises which have racked it ever since the Maidan events of 2014. That in some ways is paradoxical, because of course China is Russia's de facto ally, and Ukraine, as everyone knows, is in deep conflict with Russia and indeed identifies Russia as an aggressor and threat to itself. Nonetheless, the Ukrainians have been forced to look to China increasingly for economic help, especially since the economic help they were perhaps expecting from the West has not arrived in anything like the extent and quantity that they had expected. This particular incident concerns an important Ukrainian company called Mercouris, which is based in eastern Ukraine. Now, Mercouris is one of the crown jewel companies and businesses of the former USSR, and it was one of the key parts of the Soviet military-industrial complex. There has been much discussion about the sanctions the West has imposed upon Russia since the Ukrainian events of 2014. In my opinion, the single most serious sanctions that have been imposed on the West in terms of Russian industrial activity, and in particular in terms of the development of Russia's in military industrial economy, have been those imposed by Ukraine, and specifically those which relate to Mercouris. The reason is that under the Soviet Union, Mercouris became the USSR's primary factory and industrial plant for building gas turbine engines. Gas turbines, the major product of Mercouris, are used in aircraft engines, including helicopter and transport aircraft, and they're also used, importantly, for warships. Since 2014, the Russians have not been able to access turbines from Mercouris and had to spend vast amounts of rubles and devote great amount of time developing a turbine industry of their own. One effect has been a significant slowdown in Russian naval developments. So, to give a few simple examples, the Russians have developed an advanced new frigate system, a new frigate, the Admiral Gorshkov series, which used initially engines from Mercouris, which were no longer provided, and which the Russians have had to delay placing in series production until they were able to develop turbines and engines to replace those that they were no longer able to get from Mercouris in Ukraine. By the way, the Russians have recently achieved that capability, and it seems that production of the Admiral Gorshkov series of frigates is now finally going to get underway using new Russian-built engines based on Russian turbine technology. The same is also true of Russia's aircraft industry, and especially of Russia's helicopter industry. Russian helicopters heavily depended on engines supplied to Russia by Motor Sich. And when Motor Sich, following the sanctions that were imposed by Ukraine on Russia following the Maidan events, stopped providing Russia with those helicopter engines, Russian helicopter development significantly slowed. Once again, the Russians have successfully developed aircraft engines, helicopter engines, to replace those previously provided by Motor Sich, but it has taken them 7 years to do so. Having said that, whilst the failure of Motor Sich to supply turbines and gas turbine engines to Russia has been a significant headache for Russia, it has been a major crisis for Motor Sich. Motor Sich, essentially, after 2014, lost its key customer. Attempts by Ukraine and by Motor Sich to sell these turbines and these engines in the West have never been successful. And for a time, it looked as if Motor Sich was essentially doomed. Who stepped in and basically saved Motor Sich from closure? The answer is China. China has also been involved in developing a major naval program and a major aircraft program, and China being somewhat backward in this field of technology, advanced gas turbine engines for its ships and for its aircraft, turned to Motor Sich. In fact, the Chinese didn't just turn to Motor Sich, they actually bought it. A majority stake in Motor Sich is now owned by Chinese investors. And in fact, Chinese ships have increasingly been sailing with engines that have either been sourced directly from Motor Sich or which are based upon design plans provided from Motor Sich. This has, however, become increasingly difficult because Ukraine politically is heavily aligned to the West, and as we know, the United States has been having problems of its own with China and has become increasingly concerned about Chinese naval developments in the Far East. So the United States has apparently been putting pressure on Ukraine to slow down sale of engines and gas turbine technology by Motor Sich to China. And in fact, the latest word is that Ukraine, presumably under US pressure, has been considering nationalizing Motor Sich, thereby bringing Motor Sich directly under Ukrainian government control, displacing the Chinese investors who own the plant, and in effect, presumably, ending the connection between Motor Sich and China. This has, unsurprisingly, caused concern to the Chinese, and it may be, and it may not, it may be connected to that fact that the Chinese have recently sent a strong trade delegation to Crimea, the peninsula in the Black Sea that was previously, until 2014, juridically under Ukraine, but which seceded from Ukraine following the Maidan events and is now part of Russia, or at least is, as the Russians would say, part of Russia. The United States and the West do not recognize that fact. And Ukraine has apparently responded negatively to the presence of this Chinese delegation in Crimea, seeing it as a potential sign that China is preparing to recognize Crimea as part of Russia instead of as part of Ukraine. So this is the background to the Chinese warning, and I'm now going to provide the context in which it was given. The warning was given by a China's deputy foreign minister and the spokesperson of the Chinese Foreign Ministry, Zhao Lijian, at the regular press conference of the Chinese Foreign Ministry on March 15th, 2021. Now, this is a very interesting exchange because all the indications are that it was very carefully coordinated by the Chinese and the Russians. And I'm going to read exactly what was said. Now, the question which was posed to the Chinese official actually came from RIA Novosti, which is, of course, Russia's major media organization. And it was as follows. A Chinese business delegation visited Crimea yesterday. Yesterday would have been Sunday, 14th March 2021. Today, Ukrainian parliament member Mr. Vadim Rabinovich said that was China's reaction to the Ukrainian government's decision to nationalize aircraft engine manufacturer company Mercouris, which is now majority owned by Chinese investors. According to Mr. Vadim Rabinovich, China changed position towards Crimea. That is why China made the decision to send a business delegation to Crimea. I wonder what is China's comment on this. Very carefully planted question, one which I am sure was arranged in advance between the Chinese and the Russians on the eve of this press conference. And this is what Zhao Lijian, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson, said in response to that. China's position on the Crimea issue is consistent. We hope relevant sides can properly address the issue through dialogue and consultation. Some Chinese companies, based on historically established ties and practical needs, conduct exchanges and cooperation with Crimea on the basis of market principles. Such commercial activities should not be politicized. Now, notice here Zhao Lijian's question, and we need, I think, to parse it because every word has been very carefully chosen. First of all, there is no outright denial from Zhao Lijian that the dispatch of this Chinese delegation to Crimea was a response to the Ukrainian moves to divest Chinese investors of their stake in Mercouris by nationalizing that plant. Zhao Lijian says absolutely nothing about that at all. On the topic of Crimea, he says this: China's position on the Crimea issue is consistent. Consistent with what? Again, Zhao Lijian does not say. He does not say that China continues to recognize Crimea as part of Ukraine. He simply says it's consistent. So again, what does that actually mean? He then says that China hopes that the sides, presumably he means Ukraine and Russia, can properly address the issue through dialogue and consultation. Well, of course, Ukraine does not want to negotiate with Russia about Crimea. In fact, Ukraine refuses to negotiate with Russia about anything. So that clearly indicates pressure on Ukraine, at least at some level. And then when he talks about Chinese companies based on historically established ties and practical needs, conducting exchanges and cooperation with Crimea on the basis of market principles, what he is saying is that those companies, those Chinese companies, and by extension China, will continue their business in Crimea, irrespective of what Ukraine thinks about it. So, a clear hint by China that this process of Chinese engagement in Crimea will continue, and no denial from China that this move is indeed related to the Ukrainian decision to nationalize Motor Sich and divest the Chinese of their interests in that company. And lastly, of course, he gives the what is now become almost the standard mantra: such commercial activities should not be politicized. That is, of course, an echo of what the Russians, and by the way also the Germans, repeatedly say about Nord Stream 2. They insist Nord Stream 2 is an economic, commercial project, and they criticize Ukraine, amongst other countries, for politicizing that topic. It's almost as if the Chinese are repeating the same language about Crimea that the Russians use about Nord Stream 2. So, this is a clear hint to China of its increasing annoyance and indeed exasperation with Ukraine. Now, there are a number of economic and technological factors here at play also. Firstly, China is not as dependent on Motor Sich as it used to be. I mean, China is actually the world's biggest producer of turbines, and its technology in this field has advanced significantly. Also, as I said previously, the Russians have now mastered the manufacture of these products. They always possessed, of course, the technological skills to do it. It's worth bearing in mind that anything that Ukraine could produce, Russia would know about, because Ukraine's knowledge to produce these products comes from the Soviet Union, which was, of course, the country of which Russia was also a part, and of which Russia is the main inheritor. So the Russians have mastered not just this technology, they were always familiar with it, but also the production process, and they've also presumably set up the plants to build these sort of products and machines to the extent that they need to do. It is highly likely that the Chinese will be involved in that. It is known that the Chinese, for example, have partly funded Russia's development of its new PD-35 large aircraft engine. This is going to be one of the biggest aircraft engines built outside North America to power the new generation of Chinese-Russian wide bodies that the Russians and the Chinese have been talking about. Aircraft engines like the PD-35 use essentially the same technology as Motor Sich, as the products, the engines that Motor Sich produces. And in fact, Motor Sich historically was a large manufacturer, a big manufacturer of big aircraft engines for the Soviet Union, though that production seems essentially to have come to a stop. So the Chinese are no longer as dependent on Motor Sich as they once were. They're able to produce a lot of this equipment and technology and these products themselves, and they can also turn increasingly to the Russians to help them fill any gaps when they are needed. At the same time, of course, the geopolitics of all of this have also changed. China and Russia have grown closer together, especially over the last 2 years, as China finds itself in confrontation with the United States. And China also, I think, is becoming increasingly wary of Ukraine, which it sees as altogether too closely aligned to the West. But these Chinese moves cannot be separated, in my opinion, from the recent events in Ukraine, including the topic which I discussed in a recent program, this attempt by this talk about Ukraine launching a potential or possible attack on eastern Ukraine. I don't think, for the reasons I set out in that program, that that is what the Ukrainians actually intend to do, but it is undoubtedly the case that there have been rumors about this, and what is indisputably the case is that President Zelensky and his government are intending to hold a major conference on Crimea in August of this year, during which they again are going to try to rally international opinion in support of the Ukrainian position that Crimea is occupied territory which belongs to Ukraine and not to Russia. So the Chinese are hinting clearly to the Ukrainians that they just don't accept this, they won't support this, and that if Ukraine expects to get backing from China on this issue, then its hopes and prospects are going to be dashed. So this is a decision China has taken, a warning China has given to Ukraine, a very carefully worded, very discreet warning, as is often the case with China, directed at Ukraine, which achieves multiple purposes. Firstly, it does represent a shift in Chinese perspectives towards Crimea, just as the Ukrainians feel it does. It shows Chinese support for Russia on the Crimea issue. It also shows that, as between Ukraine and Russia, China is now very obviously and decisively tilting towards Russia. It also has to be seen as a threat to Ukraine in case Ukraine decides to take any moves to escalate the crisis in eastern Ukraine and elsewhere with respect to Russia. The Chinese are dropping a very heavy hint that they will be very displeased if Ukraine takes any step like that, and that China will be backing Russia in any conflict that ensues arising from that. Last but not least, it is an indication to Ukraine that if Ukraine does press ahead and starts moving against Chinese commercial interests in Ukraine itself, there will be a significant price to pay with China scaling down its investments in Ukraine and redirecting those investments away from Ukraine and towards Russia. Ukraine is in a dead end, and that is something that I think Ukrainian leaders need to start to understand. There are some indications that a few of them do. Obviously, Viktor Medvedchuk, who is the head of the largest opposition party in Ukraine, has been talking about this a lot, and he's quite straightforward and open about this. But he is widely considered in Ukraine a pro-Russian politician. However, others seem to be thinking or starting to think in the same way. Igor Kolomoisky, the businessman who was formerly President Zelensky's patron, has recently been sanctioned by the United States, possibly because he has been talking to a certain extent and to an increasing degree precisely upon these lines also. But the fact is, whilst Ukraine retains its present course, its industrial economy, or what is left of it, is going increasingly to seed. Ukraine's attempts to find buyers for Motor City's products in the West have proved a complete failure. It is now at high risk of losing Motor City's major remaining industrial partner. The same is happening to other major Ukrainian assets. The big factory in Dnipropetrovsk, Dnipro as the Ukrainians now call it, which used to build liquid fuel engines for the Soviet ballistic missile and space programs, is apparently practically at a standstill. It's Antonov, the Antonov aircraft factory, has faced bankruptcy on numerous occasions and is also increasingly finding it increasingly difficult to sell its products. The entire eastern Ukrainian industrial region is gradually slowing down and falling apart. In fact, it's not so gradual, it's becoming increasingly rapid. Ukraine's hopes of selling agricultural products to the West, to the European Union especially, have not been realized because they come up against the powerful agricultural interests in the European Union itself. Ukraine needs to start to rebalance its policies and to start thinking about restoring at least some of its economic links with Russia. These threats of action in eastern Ukraine and of action against Crimea are completely self-defeating and push Ukraine ever further down the blind alley it has followed ever since the events of 2014. If Ukraine cannot do that, then the forces of decay that grip the country are certain to grow even stronger. Already there are indications that a very large part of Ukraine's population has left Ukraine, and that Ukraine's actual population, or at least the actual part of Ukraine's population that is resident in Ukraine itself, has fallen considerably, though nobody knows by how much, since Ukraine refuses to conduct a census and does not provide any up-to-date population figures. Having said this, even though the logic of a rapprochement with Russia is obvious, the political obstacles to doing that seem to be insurmountable. Every time the topic is discussed, there is predictable opposition within the right-wing forces in Ukraine itself, and often this turns and spirals into violence. Every Ukrainian leader who has actually sought some sort of modus vivendi with Russia, be it Leonid Kuchma, who was president through much of the 1990s and early 2000s, or Viktor Yanukovych, who was the president who was overthrown in the 2014 events. Any president who tries to do that runs into massive obstacles and enormous pressure and is threatened with overthrow himself. President Zelensky came to power hinting that he wanted to end the war and to make peace in eastern Ukraine and to improve the position of Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine. He too has found it politically impossible to pursue that objective. And like every other Ukrainian leader before him, including Kuchma and Yanukovych, he is being pulled towards an anti-Russian position, which is completely contrary to Ukraine's interests. It looks as if Ukraine is trapped in this cul-de-sac, which is causing its economy and its society to gradually spiral down, even as Ukraine loses more and more of its friends, including, as it now appears, China itself. Thank you for joining me for this program. I look forward to you joining me in future programs for this channel and also for my other channels, for the other channels I do with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou at the Duran. Please also check out Alex's own channel. Please also check out our new channel where we publish the interactions between ourselves and our viewers in our live shows. Please also check us out on our platforms, our various platforms, BitChute, Library, Rumble, and especially Odyssey, which we have found, by the way, to be a wonderful platform. Please also support us to the extent that you can through PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribestar. Remember that we accept donations in Bitcoin and other such currencies. Please also look up our Discord server. And last but not least, please don't forget to check out our shop to see the great products that you will find there. Our amazing t-shirts, 100% cotton, long-sleeved and short-sleeved, our sweatshirts, our hoodies, our hats, and our famous magic mugs. And I look forward to you joining me in future programs on this channel, and have a wonderful day until then.